May 7, 1945. In a requisitioned German villa near Frankfurt, General George S. Patton sat facing Dwight Eisenhower. Outside, American soldiers were celebrating the announcement of the German surrender, but Patton was somber. He had not come to celebrate, but to convey to the Supreme Commander a truth that would permanently strain their relationship and, within a few months, cost him his command. A position that Washington and the press would judge as senseless. "Sooner or later we'll have to face them," he said in a firm tone. "Better to do it now, while our forces are intact and able to prevail." The target of his words was not the Germans, but the Soviet Union. Eisenhower remained motionless, his gaze fixed on him. For years, he had been working to maintain the fragile alliance with Moscow, essential for defeating Hitler. The American public saw Stalin as a reliable ally. Newspapers portrayed him as a symbol of resistance. The idea of attacking the Soviets was not only unprecedented, it seemed like a betrayal. "George, you completely ignore the political dimension," Eisenhower replied. "The war is over. It's time to go home." At that moment, Patton realized something disheartening. Eisenhower sensed the danger, but he would not act. The silence that fell between them carried the weight of a diagnosis ignored. Patton had recognized the Soviet threat when Washington did not even want to hear about it. He had proposed military action at a moment when the Red Army was exhausted and American forces were at peak efficiency. But his analysis was set aside by those who valued public opinion more than strategic reality. Patton's Third Army had penetrated deeper into the heart of Germany than any other Allied force. His units had reached Czechoslovakia, and the vanguards were in positions from which Berlin was within reach. Yet what struck Patton in those regions was not victory, but the massive Soviet presence. The Red Army was imposing its authority over Eastern Europe with a brutality that left even the most seasoned American soldiers stunned. Intelligence reports spoke of widespread violence, looting, and summary executions of civilians suspected of opposing communism. Entire communities were forcibly relocated to Soviet labor camps. Meanwhile, Patton wrote to his wife Beatrice words that expressed his judgment without filters. "I have no desire to understand them, except to estimate how much lead or iron it will take to stop them. The Russians seem to me the true unknown of the future world political structure." For him, it was clear what American diplomats refused to acknowledge: the Soviet Union was not a temporary partner, but a totalitarian power determined to expand westward, while in America people continued to place trust in the naive idea that Stalin would respect democratic commitments and free elections. Patton also met American soldiers who had been liberated by the Soviets after the German surrender. Their accounts were disturbing: conditions worse than those endured in German camps, personal belongings seized, officers beaten or even executed for protesting. Reports on the Soviet advance kept piling up without pause. The Russians were dismantling entire German industrial complexes and transporting them beyond the Urals. At the same time, they were installing Moscow-controlled governments in Poland, Romania, Hungary, and Bulgaria. Anyone who had fought against communism during the Nazi occupation was arrested or eliminated through summary trials. By May 1945, Patton was no longer merely venting his frustration. He had put together a detailed operational plan, based on a realistic assessment of the Red Army's weaknesses. His evaluation was straightforward. After the devastation of the war against Germany, 27 million dead, the Soviet Army was exhausted, scattered across an immense territory, and largely supplied with materials seized from the Germans. Soviet logistical lines stretched for thousands of kilometers, while American supply lines remained solid and protected. Moreover, U.S. forces enjoyed total air superiority. To Patterson, the Under-Secretary of War, Patton declared, "We could defeat the Russians in 6 weeks." And this was no exaggeration. The Soviet Union did not have strategic bombers capable of long-range strikes, and its anti-aircraft defenses were weak. The American Air Force could have quickly paralyzed the flow of Soviet supplies. Even the famous Soviet tank production had a weak side. After years of relentless fighting, many vehicles were worn out and unreliable. American M4 Shermans, though less heavily armored, were robust and extremely numerous. But for Patton, the key factor was another: morale. Soviet soldiers had been mobilized to repel the German invaders. Few were eager to remain and permanently occupy Eastern Europe. If we advanced eastward, he argued, many would surrender or desert. He even went so far as to propose an idea that seemed scandalous to Washington: employing captured German forces. There are hundreds of thousands of Wehrmacht men who would rather fight the Russians than be locked in prison camps, he said. He also wrote, I would prefer a German division at my side over a Soviet one. A statement that, once leaked to the press, caused a scandal. Eisenhower rejected his plan also for practical reasons. The American public wanted soldiers to return home immediately. Congress was pushing for drastic demobilization, and U.S. units were deployed for the occupation of Germany, not for a major advance into Poland. But these were not the decisive reasons for his rejection. Not the real motivations. The reasons Patton's plan was shelved had nothing to do with military strategy. The issue was political. Harry Truman had just entered the White House and was maintaining the line of cooperation with Stalin that Roosevelt had established. The Yalta agreements had already outlined the future structure of Europe, and Eisenhower knew that even suggesting the idea of an attack on the USSR would amount to institutional suicide. He would be accused of wanting to prolong the war, of betraying the alliance, and of jeopardizing the fragile peace. The press would have overwhelmed him, and Washington would have relieved him of command without hesitation. There was also a personal element. Eisenhower emerged from the European campaign as the man of the moment. Newspapers and politicians hailed him as a hero, and some were already speaking of a possible future presidency. He had no reason to risk all that prestige in a new international conflict. Above all, he believed in diplomacy. He thought Stalin could be contained through negotiation, that the Soviet Union would soften with the end of hostilities, and that the nascent United Nations could mediate among the great powers. This was the fundamental gap between him and Patton. Eisenhower had a political, institutional vision. Patton viewed the world through the mindset of a field commander, evaluating timing, opportunities, and military vulnerabilities. George sees every problem as an armed conflict, Eisenhower confided to his chief of staff. He doesn't understand that with these people we will have to coexist. Patton, however, was not the only one to interpret events this way. Winston Churchill reached the same conclusions. The British Prime Minister had warned about the role of the USSR since the Bolshevik Revolution and had allied with Stalin only out of necessity. In April 1945, he bombarded Truman and Eisenhower with requests. He wanted the Western armies to advance as far east as possible before the Soviets could consolidate their control. He hoped to occupy Berlin, Prague, and Vienna before the arrival of the Red Army. On May 12, 1945, he wrote to Truman, "An iron curtain is descending across the continent." It was the first time he used the expression that would later become a symbol of the Cold War. "We do not know what is happening on the other side of it." That same month, Churchill ordered his military leaders to evaluate an offensive plan, called Operation Unthinkable. The idea was bold, a coordinated attack that would push the USSR out of Poland and Eastern Europe, even employing rearmed German units alongside American and British forces. The British High Command analyzed the plan and deemed it feasible if launched immediately, while warning that it would require total commitment. Churchill presented it to Truman. Truman rejected it immediately, horrified at the idea of striking the USSR and even more at the thought of putting weapons back into German hands. When Patton discovered that Churchill had imagined a plan similar to his own, he felt a sense of validation. "At least someone in power understands what lies ahead," he told his aides. Churchill's concerns about Soviet ambitions were almost immediately confirmed. Patton, who had been the darling of the American press during the war, saw the media climate turn against him within a few weeks. Between May and June 1945, some of his observations on the USSR ended up in newspapers. His proposal to rearm German units, intended as an emergency measure against the Red Army, was portrayed as a kind of nostalgia for the old enemy. Influential commentators questioned his judgment. Drew Pearson wrote, General Patton's recent statements on the Soviet Union raise serious questions about his judgment. While the country desires peace, Patton seems intent on taking the opposite path. The New York Times suggested that the general did not understand post-war diplomatic dynamics. Time openly asked whether a man with such a combative personality was fit to manage peace. No one, however, reported what Patton was actually signaling from the Eastern Territories: deportations, violence, systematic repression. The image that took hold in the media was simple and convenient. Patton, brilliant in war, could not adapt to the end of hostilities. By August 1945, Eisenhower was already under pressure from Washington to remove him. The opportunity came with the issue of denazification. At a press conference, Patton stated that indiscriminately removing every former Nazi Party member from administrative functions was illogical. Many, he explained, had joined only to survive the system. He compared the situation to an American internal political dispute. This Nazi business is similar to the electoral battles between Democrats and Republicans. The comment was interpreted as a dangerous minimization of Nazi crimes, and the reaction was fierce. On September 28, 1945, Eisenhower relieved him of command of the Third Army. The official justification cited his statements on denazification. But everyone understood the real reason. Patton continued to raise alarms about Soviet expansionism. Once removed, he spent the last months of the year gathering evidence of Soviet actions and sending increasingly urgent letters to Washington. Those from October and November seemed to foreshadow the years to come. "Keep the boots polished and the bayonets sharp, and show the Red Army a determined face," he wrote. "It is the only language they understand. If we do not, then yes, we have defeated the Germans, but we have already lost the war." In early December 1945, he met again with Under-Secretary Patterson. He told him that the Soviets would turn Eastern Europe into a permanent occupation zone and that communism would attempt to spread westward. A direct confrontation, he argued, was not a remote possibility. It was only a matter of time. "We will have to face them, sooner or later," he reiterated. "And in 5, 10, or 20 years we will regret not having done it when we had the chance, in 1945. Patterson listened politely, but it was clear Washington did not intend to follow that path. The country wanted peace, not a new war. And Patton's warnings remained without political outlet. 3 days later, on December 9, 1945, Patton was involved in a serious car accident near Mannheim. His staff car was struck by a truck, and he suffered injuries that left him paralyzed from the neck down. He died on December 21. The timing, just 12 days after his last warnings to Washington, fed suspicions and conspiracy theories for years. The truck driver offered a version of events that many found unconvincing, but no solid evidence ever emerged suggesting an assassination. Most likely, it was a tragic accident, one that, however, permanently silenced the only general willing to openly warn about the Soviet threat. The events that followed confirmed much of his predictions. By 1946, the Soviet Union had consolidated its control over Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. The free elections promised at Yalta never materialized. In Poland, resistance leaders, the same who had fought the Nazis for 6 years, were arrested, summarily tried, or sent to labor camps. In Czechoslovakia, the 1948 coup abolished the democratic government, and the suspicious death of Foreign Minister Jan Masaryk was recorded as a suicide. The same pattern repeated everywhere: military occupation, installation of communist governments, and systematic suppression of opposition. Between 1945 and 1989, the regimes of Eastern Europe caused the deaths of about 1 million people, while millions more endured imprisonment, torture, or political persecution. The Iron Curtain, evoked by Churchill, became a permanent barrier. And the Cold War, the conflict Churchill had hoped to prevent, would last 45 years, drain colossal resources, and fuel proxy wars across the globe. In the following years, the Soviet advance did not stop. In 1949, Moscow tested its first atomic weapons. In 1950, responding to communist expansion required intervention in Korea. Patton maintained that May 1945 had been the only moment when a preventive military action still had a chance. The Red Army was exhausted, and the United States at the peak of its power. Perhaps he was right about that window of opportunity. Whether an offensive would really have succeeded remains speculative. That it was politically unfeasible, however, is certain. But subsequent developments confirmed the picture Patton had drawn. Soviet dominance in the East became permanent, expansion continued, and a global military confrontation proved inevitable. The only variable was when, not if, it would happen. In the decades that followed, his name often resurfaced in strategic discussions. The analyses he had produced in 1945 found echoes both in official documents and in political commentary. In 1947, George Kennan's Long Telegram described Soviet expansionism in terms that closely mirrored Patton's warnings. The Truman Doctrine officially committed the United States to containing Moscow, while accepting that Eastern Europe would remain under Soviet control, a compromise that led to limited wars in Korea and Vietnam, and to the prolonged confrontation that Patton had believed could have been avoided. In the post-war years, many conservatives cited Patton as an unheeded prophet. Douglas MacArthur, also at odds with Truman during the Korean War, wrote that Patton had sensed the need to oppose communism militarily. In the 1980s, Ronald Reagan openly adopted his language and ideas, speaking of the Soviet Union as an evil empire, and pursuing a policy of firmness that Patton would have recognized as his own. When the Berlin Wall fell in 1989 and the USSR collapsed in 1991, many argued that this hardline approach had retrospectively confirmed the general's warnings. Had Patton been listened to, Eastern Europe might have known freedom 45 years earlier. He had identified the danger when almost no one in the United States wanted to admit it existed. He had proposed a military response while it was still possible, and paid the price for speaking truths that politics was not ready to tolerate, enduring isolation and removal from command. The question of whether Patton was right in 1945 goes beyond historical curiosity. It touches on strategic dilemmas that remain relevant today. When is the right moment to confront an emerging threat militarily, rather than relying on diplomacy? Should commanders insist on what they consider strategically necessary, even if politically impossible? These questions, raised by Patton more than 70 years ago, recur in every generation. After September 11th, the debate over terrorism brought up the same issue: act preemptively or wait for the danger to materialize? With the rise of China, the same questions today concern Beijing's expansion: intervene now, while relative superiority is still on our side, or wait? Patton's warnings resonate because they embody the warrior's perspective. A threat must be confronted while it is vulnerable, not allowed to grow until it becomes uncontrollable. It is a viewpoint constantly in tension with that of the diplomat, who prefers to manage conflicts through negotiation and compromise. Patton's removal from command can be interpreted in two ways: as a sign that the system works, because a general who does not recognize civilian authority is corrected, or as a failure, because an officer who correctly understood the greatest threat was silenced for political reasons. This dilemma is not only historical. The next generation of military leaders will face the same problems. When they see dangers that politicians want to ignore, should they remain silent or speak out? Patton's answer was unequivocal: tell the truth, at any cost. He paid dearly for that choice, losing his career and perhaps even his life, but he ensured that his words would not be forgotten. Eisenhower's refusal to support Patton reflected his conception of leadership. Eisenhower was a master at building coalitions and keeping them together during the war, but this ability made him unable to accept the general's argument. Patton argued that one of the coalition's pillars was, in fact, an enemy, undermining everything Eisenhower had built his reputation on. Moreover, Eisenhower wanted to be loved by the public. Supporting an attack against the Soviet Union would have made him the face of a conflict the nation did not want. By 1945, the media and public opinion considered him a war hero and a potential presidential candidate. Any military action against the Soviets would have been political suicide. The country was weary, the citizens wanted peace, and the press would have demolished him for risking a new world war. Eisenhower chose the safest path politically. He ignored Patton's warnings, removed him when he continued to insist, and carried on cooperating with Stalin. Politically understandable, strategically disastrous. Later, he admitted to having underestimated the Soviet threat, but he never acknowledged that Patton had been right in calling for immediate military action. For Eisenhower, it was all too risky and politically unfeasible. This was the limit of his genius. He excelled at building coalitions and managing political realities, but he struggled to see beyond immediate constraints to the long-term strategic consequences. Patton, by contrast, cared little for career or public approval. What mattered was the opportunity to strike an enemy of America when it was vulnerable. On December 21, 1945, at 60 years old, Patton died paralyzed in a hospital bed. He was buried at the American Cemetery in Luxembourg, among the soldiers of the Third Army, as he had requested, among those he had led on the battlefield. In death, his name became symbolic. For conservatives, he represented the clear-sighted warrior, able to recognize threats and prefer force over accommodation. For liberals, he embodied the dangerous militarist, ready to sacrifice diplomacy for war. For the public, he remained the brilliant tank commander who helped win World War II. Subsequent events confirmed his predictions: the Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe, the global expansion of communism, the decades-long Cold War, and millions of deaths under authoritarian regimes. Whether his strategy would have worked cannot be known for certain, but it is indisputable that he correctly identified the threat long before most American leaders did. Patton's tragedy was being right at the wrong time. In 1945, he saw what others would not recognize until 2 years later. He proposed action when it could still succeed, but was silenced before he could implement it. He died without being able to say, "I told you so." The generation of American leaders that ignored his warnings later fought the Cold War Patton had foreseen. They spent 45 years and trillions of dollars to contain a Soviet power that might, perhaps, have been stopped in 1945. The correctness of those choices remains debated, but the consequences were enormous and undeniable. Patton's voice echoes through the decades as a warning: the prophet can be ignored, those who speak the truth can be silenced, the warrior who sees clearly can be removed by politicians who prefer convenient lies to uncomfortable truths. The lesson is not that the United States should have attacked the Soviet Union. It is that strategic threats should be confronted while they are vulnerable, not allowed to grow until uncontrollable. Political constraints should guide, but not determine, military strategy. And generals who speak plainly must be heard, even when their message is unwelcome. These lessons were learned at great cost over half a century. And perhaps they will need to be learned again. If you enjoyed this story, give a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. See you in the next video.